Well, here we are back in Helena, Montana on another fine Montana morning. It's 4 degrees, about a foot of snow. We're on Last Chance Gulch, and I'm next to a sculpture of a newsboy by Becky Eichert. Typifying the young gentleman that used to sell newspapers up and down this main street of Helena. The idea of newsboys started clear back during the Mexican War when there was a penny press, they called it. There were big newspapers in New York and Boston and Philadelphia and Baltimore, and then they were connected up with a big 27 newspapers down in New Orleans, and some really big ones, 6 or 8 that were either for or against the war in Mexico, or they were trying to be neutral. But anyhow, there was a connection, a high-speed connection between those papers in the Northeast at Philadelphia and Baltimore, down by train down through Richmond, and then horseback. There was no telegraph until telegraph got to Richmond in 1847. So they would take by the fastest means possible, horseback if necessary, down to Mobile, Alabama, and then they would take a boat over to New Orleans. And on the boat, the news from the Northeast would get to New Orleans. The people on the boat would be setting the type, and then when they get to New Orleans, which was a coastal city on the Mississippi, they would rush the type over to the printing press and get the printing press cranked up and then send out the extra there in New Orleans. New Orleans' biggest newspaper was called the Picayune, but there were a couple of papers that were really good down there, and they were pretty well admired by the other newspapers in the country. But they were considered the war press because the city of New Orleans was right close. It would get steamers coming in from Corpus Christi, where the Army was, or from down in San Isabel, where the Army was later at the mouth of the Rio Grande, or they'd get them from Mexico and Cuba. They'd get the whole story, and as soon as a ship landed there on the levee at New Orleans, the newspaper reporters would be up trying to buttonhole anybody. They would tell them what was going on. And remember, there was still 2 weeks to go to get the news back up to the Northeast. There was very little news about what was going on out in California and over in New Mexico. There just wasn't anything coming back. It was just letters from soldiers, and then later on, stories, history stories. But the real stories about the war that were current came out of New Orleans. So this penny press, New Orleans sold, the Picayune sold its newspapers for 6 cents, and the other big newspapers in New Orleans sold it for 10 cents. So that's why they called it the penny press, and these little guys would make money. I remember in Butte there were newsboys. They would fight for the street corners. They used to tell me when they were kids, who would get the best street corner because they could make money by selling more newspapers. And there were some newspapers in New York, like the Tribune. They could get 3 extras out in a day. They'd get just some news story, and they'd put it on the press, and they'd send that extra out. People would just gobble it up. There was a feeling that the war in Mexico was a good thing. That's how a lot of people felt. It would be as if MAGA was pretty much dominant in the country, and they wanted to expand into Mexico, and the big word was manifest destiny, that somehow we were entitled to invade another country. And of course in New Orleans, they really liked that idea because they were making money hand over fist in that town. There was 27 consulates in New Orleans, a real exotic city. The papers were in 4 languages, Spanish, English, German, and French. And so that was a going operation down there, and that's where our war press was. I think it's interesting that the little guy here, the newsboy, is all covered with snow, and it kind of reminds me of the fact that our press here in this country, if it really took off during the war with Mexico, it seems as though it's in a decline now. There's thousands of newspaper jobs have gone, disappeared, and they expect this year there'll be thousands more. And so it's very important to find a source of news that has reporters that are trained to tell the truth from the lies. Nobody's immune from bending it a little bit, but finding people that are trained to tell truth from lies is really very important. And but again, even in New York, where Horace Greeley had the Tribune, he would he would he would be against the war in Mexico, thinking it was just a terrible, bloody slaughter for no good reason. And at the same time, he had to get his newspaper sold. So that's one of the big weaknesses with the press. You know, they got to make some money to pay their reporters, and so therein is a problem. But I think that it's very important to try to find the best sources of information that'll tell us the truth, because we need the truth separated from lies to keep ourselves from falling into war, because the first casualty of war is truth, and wars are often about lies. So here's this little guy and me out here freezing on Last Chance Gulch, asking you to do the best you can. I'll do the best I can to find sources of information that are accurate, and see if we can learn from our past.